The autumn morning in London was crisp and clear when Donald Trump Jr. stepped out of his black SUV at Buckingham Palace. He adjusted his expensive suit jacket and checked his gold watch, feeling important and powerful. The visit was supposed to be a routine diplomatic meeting between his father's administration and the British royal family, but Donald Jr. had his own ideas about how things should go. As he walked toward the palace entrance, he noticed the famous red-coated guards standing perfectly still at their posts. These were the Queen's Guard, soldiers known worldwide for their discipline and dedication. They stood like statues, their tall black hats perfectly straight, their rifles held at exactly the right angle. Tourists gathered around them every day trying to make them laugh or move, but the guards never broke their concentration. Donald Jr. had heard stories about these guards before. People said they were just for show, like museum pieces dressed up to entertain visitors. He believed they were nothing more than actors in fancy costumes playing a role for the cameras. This morning, he was in a particularly bad mood after a difficult phone call with his father about some business deals that weren't going well. The palace staff had briefed him about proper behavior during royal visits. They explained the traditions, the protocols, and the respect required in such a historic place. But Donald Jr. wasn't really listening during the briefing. He was thinking about his phone, his social media accounts, and how he could use this visit to boost his own image. As he approached the main entrance, something about the guards annoyed him. Maybe it was their perfect posture, or the way tourists were taking pictures with them. Maybe it was because they seemed so serious about what he thought was just a silly job. Whatever the reason, he decided these guards needed to learn who was really important here. The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as Donald Jr. made his decision. He would show everyone, including these pretend soldiers, that when a Trump visited, things happened differently. He had no idea that his next actions would create a moment that people would talk about for years to come. The guard he approached was a young man named James Mitchell, though Donald Jr. didn't bother to learn his name. James had been serving in the Queen's Guard for 3 years. He had trained for months to earn this position, learning not just how to stand perfectly still, but also how to handle difficult situations with dignity and wit. James had seen all kinds of people during his time on duty. Rude tourists, excited children, and even celebrities who thought the rules didn't apply to them. But he had never encountered someone quite like the man walking toward him with such obvious arrogance. The other guards nearby could sense something was about to happen. They remained perfectly still as their training required, but their eyes were alert. Palace security was also watching. Though they stayed at a respectful distance unless needed, Donald Jr. stopped directly in front of James, close enough that he could see his own reflection in the guard's polished boots. He looked up at the young soldier's face, expecting to see fear or nervousness. Instead, he saw only calm professionalism. The moment was set. In a place where tradition and respect had ruled for centuries, a clash was about to unfold between old-world discipline and new-world entitlement. Neither man knew it yet, but their brief encounter would become a story that perfectly captured the difference between earned respect and assumed privilege. Donald Jr. crossed his arms and stared at the guard with growing irritation. The morning was getting warmer, and he was already running late for his scheduled meeting inside the palace. But something about this soldier's perfect stillness bothered him more than being late ever could. "Hey, you there," Donald Jr. said loudly, his voice carrying across the courtyard. Several tourists turned to look, pulling out their phones to record what they sensed might become an interesting moment. "I'm talking to you, soldier boy." James Mitchell remained motionless, his eyes focused straight ahead as his training demanded. The Queen's Guard had strict rules about when they could speak or move during their duty. Breaking position without proper cause could result in serious disciplinary action, something James took very seriously. "Are you deaf or just stupid?" Donald Jr. stepped closer, his voice getting louder and more aggressive. "I said I'm talking to you. Do you know who I am?" A small crowd was gathering now, phones and cameras pointed in their direction. Palace security guards moved slightly closer but didn't intervene yet. They knew the Queen's Guard were trained to handle difficult situations, and they wanted to see how this would play out. Donald Jr. was used to getting immediate attention wherever he went. In his world, money and family name opened every door and commanded instant respect. The fact that this guard was completely ignoring him felt like a personal insult that needed to be corrected immediately. My father is the President of the United States, he continued, his face getting redder. That makes me more important than you. More important than this whole ridiculous costume party you've got going on here. James could hear every word clearly, but his training was stronger than any urge to respond. He had been taught that the Queen's Guard represented something bigger than themselves. They stood for tradition, duty, and the dignity of the crown. Personal insults were nothing compared to that responsibility. The crowd was growing larger now. Word was spreading through the tourist groups that something dramatic was happening at the palace. People were sharing live videos on social media, and the scene was starting to attract attention from news reporters who were always stationed near the palace looking for stories. Donald Jr. noticed the cameras and felt even more pressure to assert his authority. In his mind, this was about more than just one stubborn guard. This was about showing the world that American power commanded respect everywhere, even in front of ancient British palaces. "You know what your problem is?" he said, pointing his finger directly at James's chest. "You think this little game you're playing makes you special, but you're just a grown man playing dress-up for tourists." It's pathetic. Still, James didn't move or speak. His breathing remained steady, his posture perfect, but something in his eyes suggested he was listening to every word and forming his own opinions about the man standing in front of him. The palace staff, inside, were beginning to notice the commotion. Through the windows, phone calls were being made to security chiefs and protocol officers. This was exactly the kind of incident they tried to prevent during official visits, but sometimes visitors created their own problems. Donald Jr. was now completely focused on this battle of wills. He had forgotten about his scheduled meeting, his phone calls, and everything else. This guard had become a symbol of everything that frustrated him about dealing with foreign countries and their outdated traditions. "I'm giving you one last chance," he said, his voice dropping to what he thought was a threatening whisper. "Show me some respect or I'll make sure you lose this ridiculous job. My family has connections everywhere, including with your bosses." The threat hung in the air like a challenge. Everyone watching could sense that something significant was about to happen. The guard had maintained his silence and composure through everything so far. But would this final insult finally break his professional calm? The tension in the courtyard was thick enough to cut with a knife. Donald Jr. had worked himself into a fury, his expensive suit slightly wrinkled from his aggressive gestures, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. The crowd of onlookers had grown to nearly 50 people, all holding their breath to see what would happen next. James Mitchell could feel the weight of everyone's attention, but his training held firm. 3 years of discipline and countless hours of preparation had led to this moment. He knew that how he handled this situation would reflect not just on himself, but on every guard who had ever worn this uniform. "You're really going to just stand there like an idiot?" Donald Jr. demanded, his voice cracking slightly with frustration. "Fine. If you won't move, I'll move you myself." That was the moment everything changed. Donald Jr. reached out and placed his hand firmly on James's chest, intending to push him aside like an inconvenient obstacle. It was a move born of pure arrogance and complete misunderstanding of what he was dealing with. The instant Donald Jr. made physical contact, several things happened at once. Palace security guards immediately stepped forward, their hands moving toward their radio devices. The Queen's Guard protocol allowed for response when physically threatened or touched by unauthorized persons. And James Mitchell, for the first time since this confrontation began, was permitted to speak. But instead of anger or alarm, something unexpected happened. James looked down at the hand pressed against his chest, then slowly raised his eyes to meet Donald Jr.'s gaze directly. A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth, so subtle that only those standing very close could see it. "Sir," James said in a voice that was perfectly calm and crystal clear, carrying easily across the now silent courtyard. "I'm afraid you're confused about how things work here." Donald Jr. was so surprised to finally get a response that he forgot to remove his hand. He had expected shouting or submission or some kind of dramatic reaction. The guard's calm tone threw him completely off balance. "This isn't one of your father's golf courses," James continued, his voice remaining steady and professional. "And I'm not one of your employees. I serve the crown, which has been here for over 1,000 years. Your family's been famous for what, a few decades?" The crowd was completely silent now, recognizing that they were witnessing something special. Phones continued recording, but even the clicking of camera shutters seemed muted by the intensity of the moment. Donald Jr. finally removed his hand, but he was too shocked to speak. No one had ever talked to him like this before, with such quiet confidence and devastating accuracy. He was used to people either fearing his family's power or fawning over their wealth. "You see, sir," James went on, his smile becoming slightly more visible, "respect isn't something you can buy, inherit, or demand. It's something you earn through service, dedication, and character, things that can't be taught in business school or inherited from daddy." The words hit Donald Jr. like physical blows. Each sentence was delivered with perfect politeness, but the message was unmistakably clear. He was being put in his place by someone he had dismissed as a mere costume-wearing actor. Palace security had reached the scene now, but they made no move to intervene. They recognized that their colleague was handling the situation perfectly, within the bounds of protocol and proper behavior. If anything, they seemed proud of how James was representing their institution. Donald Jr. opened his mouth to respond, probably to threaten or bluster, but found that no words came out. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, he was completely outmatched in a verbal confrontation. The guard's quiet dignity had exposed his own lack of it in the most public way possible. The morning sun seemed brighter now, illuminating the scene like a spotlight on a stage where a master class in grace under pressure was being conducted by a young soldier who understood something about true strength that money could never buy. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Donald Jr. stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, searching for words that wouldn't come. The guard's response had been so unexpected, so perfectly delivered, that it had completely derailed his usual tactics of intimidation and bluster. James Mitchell remained at attention, but there was a new energy around him now. He had broken his silence not in anger or disrespect, but to deliver a lesson in dignity that everyone present would remember. The other guards nearby stood a little straighter, proud of their colleague's perfect handling of an impossible situation. "Furthermore," James continued, his voice carrying the authority of centuries of tradition, "this uniform represents something your money can't touch. Every thread, every button, every piece of brass has been earned through sacrifice and service. We don't just stand here for show, sir. We stand here because we've proven ourselves worthy of the honor." The crowd was mesmerized. Many of them had come to London specifically to see the famous guards, expecting a quaint tourist attraction. Instead, they were witnessing a masterclass in how true professionals handle disrespect with grace and strength. Donald Jr. finally found his voice, but it came out as a strangled whisper. "You can't talk to me like that. Do you know what kind of trouble you're in? I'll have your job for this." "My job," James replied smoothly, "is to protect the dignity of this place and everyone in it, including you, sir, even when they don't deserve it." The precision of that final verbal strike was breathtaking. James had managed to be both protective and insulting at the same time, offering help while making it clear exactly what he thought of the man who needed it. Palace security officers had positioned themselves strategically around the scene, but their body language suggested they were there to protect the guard from any escalation, not to arrest him for speaking out. They recognized professional excellence when they saw it, and James was demonstrating exactly why the Queen's Guard maintained their worldwide reputation. Social media was exploding. Videos of the confrontation were being shared thousands of times per minute, with viewers around the world commenting on the stark contrast between entitled behavior and earned dignity. The hashtag #GuardVsTrump was already trending in multiple countries. Donald Jr. looked around desperately, seeming to realize for the first time how many people were watching and recording. His political instincts finally kicked in, warning him that this situation was spiraling completely out of his control. Every second he stood there looking foolish was being broadcast to the world. "This isn't over," he said weakly, the threat sounding hollow even to his own ears. "My father will hear about this." "I'm sure he will, sir," James replied with that same infuriating calm. Along with everyone else, apparently. He gestured slightly toward the crowd of recording devices without breaking his perfect posture. The comment about everyone else hearing about it was the final blow. Donald Jr. suddenly realized that this humiliation wasn't just happening in front of a few tourists. This was being recorded, shared, and would probably be on news channels around the world within hours. His security detail, who had been watching from a distance, finally approached. They could see their charge was in trouble and needed extraction from a situation that was only getting worse for him with every passing moment. "Sir," one of his bodyguards said quietly, "your meeting is about to start. We should go inside now." It was a lifeline, and Donald Jr. grabbed it gratefully. But as he turned to leave, he couldn't resist one final attempt to save face. "This conversation isn't finished," he said, trying to sound threatening but mostly sounding defeated. James Mitchell nodded politely. "Of course not, sir. I'll be right here whenever you'd like to continue learning about respect and tradition. It's what we do." The crowd watched as Donald Jr. walked toward the palace entrance, his swagger replaced by the quick, awkward steps of someone eager to escape an embarrassing situation. Behind him, James returned to his perfect stillness as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Inside Buckingham Palace, the mood was electric with whispered conversations and barely contained excitement. Word of the confrontation outside had spread through the staff like wildfire, with everyone eager to hear details about how one of their guards had handled the difficult American visitor. Donald Jr. was led through the ornate hallways toward his scheduled meeting, but his mind was still spinning from what had just happened. He had been completely outmaneuvered by someone he had dismissed as unimportant, and the sting of that realization was growing worse with each step. His phone was buzzing constantly with notifications. His social media team back in America was sending urgent messages about videos that were spreading across the internet faster than they could track them. The confrontation was already being called the palace put-down, and when privilege met professionalism. The palace staff members he passed were maintaining their professional demeanor, but Donald Jr. could swear he saw knowing smiles and meaningful glances exchanged behind his back. The story was clearly spreading through the building, and he was becoming a laughingstock in one of the most prestigious places on earth. Meanwhile, outside in the courtyard, James Mitchell had returned to his stoic duty as if nothing had happened. But the crowd around him had grown even larger, with people pointing him out to their friends and family. Tour guides were already incorporating the incident into their presentations, calling it a perfect example of British composure under pressure. Other tourists who had missed the original confrontation were getting detailed recaps from those who had witnessed it. The story was being retold with growing enthusiasm, with each version highlighting different aspects of the guard's perfect responses and the visitor's complete humiliation. News crews were arriving now, having been alerted by the viral videos. Reporters were interviewing witnesses, gathering quotes about what they had seen and heard. The consensus was clear. They had watched a masterclass in how to handle bullies with grace and intelligence. Back inside the palace, Donald Jr. was finally seated in an elegant meeting room, but he couldn't concentrate on anything being said. Palace officials were discussing trade agreements and diplomatic protocols, but all he could think about was the guard's words echoing in his head. Respect isn't something you can buy, inherit, or demand. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was now sitting in a building that represented exactly the kind of earned authority and historical legitimacy that the guard had been talking about. Every painting on the walls, every piece of furniture, every ceremonial detail represented centuries of tradition that his family's wealth could never purchase. His phone continued buzzing with increasingly frantic messages from his public relations team. The videos were being shared by celebrities, politicians, and millions of regular people around the world. Comments were pouring in from every continent, almost all of them praising the guard's handling of the situation and criticizing Donald Jr.'s behavior. The meeting continued around him, but Donald Jr. found himself wondering about the guard. What was his name? Where was he from? How had someone so young learned to handle confrontation with such perfect poise? These were questions that had never occurred to him during the actual encounter, when he had been too focused on asserting his own importance. Outside, James Mitchell was thinking about something entirely different. He was remembering his training, particularly the lessons about representing something bigger than yourself. His instructors had taught him that wearing the uniform meant carrying the dignity of everyone who had worn it before him, and he felt proud that he had lived up to that responsibility. The palace security team was quietly reviewing the entire incident through multiple camera angles. They were documenting everything not to punish James, but to use his response as a training example for future situations. His handling of the confrontation would become a case study in professional behavior under pressure. Social media analysts around the world were already noting something interesting about the public response. The incident wasn't just going viral because it was dramatic or entertaining. People were sharing it because it represented something many of them wished they could say to entitled, powerful people who behaved badly. The guard had become an accidental symbol of dignity standing up to arrogance, of earned respect confronting assumed privilege. His words were being quoted, analyzed, and celebrated as a perfect example of how to maintain your principles when faced with someone who has none. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that this wasn't just a momentary internet sensation. The confrontation had touched something deeper in people around the world, and the story would have a much longer life than anyone could have predicted. By evening, the story had exploded far beyond anyone's expectations. News channels across Europe, America, and Asia were running segments about the Royal Guard's perfect response. Talk show hosts were playing the clips and discussing what the confrontation revealed about respect, authority, and proper behavior in public spaces. James Mitchell finished his shift and was approached by his commanding officer, Colonel Harrison, a stern but fair man who had served in the Queen's Guard for over 20 years. James expected to be reprimanded for breaking protocol by speaking during his duty, but instead found himself facing something he hadn't anticipated. Mitchell, Colonel Harrison said with a slight smile, in 30 years of military service, I've never seen a more perfect example of maintaining dignity under pressure. You spoke when the situation required it. You represented the Guard with honor, and you did it all without losing your composure for a single second. James was surprised by the praise. Sir, I broke silence during my post. I thought there might be disciplinary action. On the contrary, the colonel replied, you defended the honor of this institution exactly as you were trained to do. The only thing better than your words was your timing. You waited until the situation absolutely required response, and then you delivered it flawlessly. Word was spreading through the military ranks that one of their own had handled himself brilliantly in an impossible situation. Officers who had never met James were calling to congratulate the regiment on having such a fine example of military bearing in their ranks. Meanwhile, Donald Jr. had returned to his hotel, where his staff was in full crisis management mode. His father had indeed heard about the incident, along with most of the rest of the world. Phone calls were coming in from political advisors, family members, and business associates, all wanting to know what had really happened at the palace. The video clips were being analyzed frame by news commentators who pointed out every detail of Donald Jr.'s body language, facial expressions, and verbal responses. Body language experts were explaining to television audiences how his posture had changed throughout the confrontation, showing his confidence dissolving in real time. In stark contrast, the same experts praised James Mitchell's perfect maintenance of military bearing, even while delivering his devastating responses. They noted how he had managed to be both respectful and firm, professional yet pointed, never losing his composure despite intense provocation. Social media was filled with people sharing their own stories about encounters with entitled individuals, using James's responses as examples of how they wished they had handled similar situations. His words were being turned into memes, inspirational quotes, and even merchandise. The phrase, "respect isn't something you can buy," inherit, or demand was being printed on t-shirts, coffee mugs, and posters. People were using it as their social media status updates and email signatures. It had become an instant motto for anyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of unearned authority. Back at Buckingham Palace, the evening staff were still buzzing with excitement about the day's events. Many of them had served for years without ever seeing such a perfect example of what their institution represented. James had reminded everyone why they took pride in their work and their traditions. The palace's official social media accounts remained diplomatically silent about the incident, as protocol required. But unofficial palace staff accounts were sharing the videos with obvious pride in their colleagues' performance. The institution's reputation had been enhanced, not damaged, by the confrontation. International newspapers were running editorials about the incident, using it as a jumping-off point for discussions about respect, tradition, and proper behavior in official settings. The story was being analyzed from political, social, and cultural perspectives across the globe. Late that night, Donald Jr. sat in his luxury hotel room scrolling through endless social media posts about his humiliation. For someone who prided himself on understanding media and public relations, he was watching a masterclass in how quickly a story could spin completely out of control. The worst part wasn't just that he had been embarrassed. The worst part was that deep down, he knew the guard had been right about everything he had said. Respect really couldn't be bought or inherited, and Donald Jr. was beginning to understand that his entire approach to dealing with people might need serious reconsideration. Outside the hotel, London continued its ancient rhythm, with the Queen's Guard standing at their posts throughout the night, protecting traditions that had survived far greater challenges than one rude visitor's attempted intimidation. James Mitchell was off duty now, but his example would continue inspiring people around the world for years to come. 3 months later, the incident had become legendary. James Mitchell had returned to his regular duties, but his life had changed in ways he never expected. He received letters from around the world thanking him for showing how to stand up to bullies with dignity and grace. Children wrote to him saying they wanted to be like him when they grew up. The palace had quietly recognized his service with a commendation for exemplary conduct under pressure, though James insisted he had simply done his job as he was trained to do. His fellow guards treated him with increased respect, and new recruits were shown video of his performance as an example of perfect protocol execution. Universities began using the incident in their business and psychology courses as a case study in conflict, resolution, and maintaining professionalism under stress. James's responses were analyzed and praised by experts in communication, military science, and diplomatic relations. For Donald Jr., the experience had been a harsh but valuable lesson. The global reaction to the incident had forced him to confront some uncomfortable truths about his own behavior and attitude toward others. His family's wealth and influence had protected him from most consequences throughout his life, but they couldn't protect him from viral videos and worldwide ridicule. His public relations team had eventually managed to contain some of the immediate damage, but the story resurfaced regularly whenever discussions arose about privilege, respect, or proper behavior in public spaces. The incident had become a permanent part of his public image, a reminder that actions have consequences even for the wealthy and powerful. The broader impact of the confrontation continued to ripple outward. The video had been translated into dozens of languages and shared in countries where people rarely heard about British royal guards or American political families. But they understood the universal message about dignity defeating arrogance. James's words about respect being earned rather than inherited had resonated particularly strongly in countries with their own struggles against corruption and entitled leadership. His example had become a symbol of ordinary people standing up to those who abuse their power or position. The Queen's Guard, as an institution, had seen their reputation enhanced around the world. Tourism to Buckingham Palace increased significantly, with many visitors specifically hoping to see the guard who had become famous for his perfect response to an impossible situation. James himself remained humble about the attention. In interviews he rarely gave, he always emphasized that he had simply represented the values he had been taught during his training. He credited his fellow guards, his commanding officers, and the centuries of tradition he was privileged to uphold. The incident had also sparked broader conversations about how public figures should behave when representing their countries abroad. Diplomatic training programs began using the confrontation as an example of how cultural misunderstandings and personal arrogance could create international embarrassments. Social media platforms had implemented the encounter into their algorithms as an example of content that goes viral for positive reasons, rather than scandal or controversy. The respectful but firm way James had handled the situation was held up as a model for online discourse and public behavior. Years later, when James eventually retired from the Queen's Guard, he would be remembered not just as an excellent soldier, but as someone who had shown the world that true strength comes from discipline, respect, and unwavering principles. His moment of fame had lasted only minutes, but its impact would be felt for generations. The palace courtyard where it all happened looked exactly the same as it had that autumn morning. New guards stood at the same posts, maintaining the same traditions, carrying forward the same dignity that James had embodied so perfectly. Tourists still gathered to watch them, but now many came hoping to witness the kind of grace under pressure that had made one young soldier a worldwide symbol of professional excellence. The story had become part of palace lore, passed down from guard to guard as an example of how to uphold their duties with honor. And somewhere in London, James Mitchell continued his service. knowing that he had proven something important about the power of earned respect over inherited privilege, and how sometimes the most powerful response to aggression is unshakable calm and quiet dignity.